Energy Transition Now with David Linden.
Hello everyone, I'm your host, David Linden, the Head of Energy Transition for the Westwood Global Energy Group. And you're listening to Energy Transition Now, where we discuss what the transition really means for the oil and gas and the broader energy industry. In our last episode, we looked at the approach needed and the options you have to develop greenfield and adapt brownfield assets for a net zero future. More broadly though, a successful energy transition is going to rely on technology and innovation. And it's a question I often get asked is, what are oil and gas companies doing about that, especially sort of greening IOCs? What are they doing to invest that's really going to make an impact in the energy transition, and what approach are they taking? So with us today, we have the excellent Siobhan Clarke from BP Launchpad to help us look at one really, at least in my mind, fascinating model or approach that an oil company is taking. Siobhan's an operating partner at BP Launchpad, where she's investing in and scaling energy companies. Her background is in sales and strategy roles in startups and big tech, and she's also a co-author of the Founder Handbook. Siobhan, I know you have a lot on your plate at the moment with the news, at least as we're recording at the moment, of your recent acquisition of Blueprint Power. I'm sure we can talk about that in just a minute, but thanks for taking the time to come onto the podcast.
Really excited to be here, David. It's obviously a pretty great moment when you're kind of announcing into Blueprint. It just bubbles and the energy bubbles over off what we're creating here. Really excited to have the conversation today.
Well, I'm looking forward to it, that's for sure. Okay, look, I mean, as I just mentioned, a lot needs to happen if we're going to decarbonize our world economy, and technology and innovation is going to be core to that. So let's start, I guess, with the macro view. It'd be good to get your view around, how are we, so government, companies, etc. How are we going to accelerate the innovation that's needed to make the energy transition a reality?
Absolutely. I think this is one of the most interesting questions that plays out there, because there are multiple models of innovation. There's a lot of stuff that people will do in terms of their own R&D, their own development internally within companies. There's a lot that the energy industry has done in terms of moving towards investing in startups and being these strategic investors that VCs have kind of moved into in that direction. And what we've taken the approach at BP Launchpad is what I like to call extremely high conviction investing. So extremely high conviction means that we do like to take a majority position very early on in digital companies that have an ability to address net zero. And then we layer a bunch of interesting things on to help that. But before we get into that, and I think we are going to get into that on our conversation, let's take a step back to just reflect a little bit about what's been happening in terms of innovation and innovation dollars into the energy transition. Yes, so, over the last 2 or 3 years, we've seen such an acceleration of deep commitments by governments, by companies in addressing net zero and moving towards that direction. So we've had a sway of people move into that particular space in the last couple of years. The other trend that we're seeing is that the people that have been entrepreneurs who accelerated through cloud software from 2010 onwards, that have exited their businesses, that are now looking and turning around and saying, what's the next biggest problem that I should solve? And they're doing that in the light of, whoa, look at all these deep commitments that have been made. And so people with software backgrounds that have scaled and created enterprise software companies are moving into this particular space and saying, how do I bring software together, software, hardware, digital assets together with energy to solve this net zero issue? And there's a couple of data points, David, just to add into that. I mean, there's something like BNEF says that venture capitalists alone poured something like 17 billion in 2020 into climate-focused companies. By the first half of this year, so in the first 6 months, that had already reached 14 billion. So we're surpassing that, and there's this huge acceleration into that space. And we know that any early stage entrepreneurs, they need funding and support from investors who understand the technologies that are moving from lab to market and their technology readiness levels. They need investors who can break the mold of short investment cycles and really challenge risk profiles. And so we're seeing a very different profile of investor come in to support and scale these growing companies. And so funding is one of those challenges, but it also takes more than that. It's about people, it's about talent, it's about scaling and setting on the shoulders of others.
Okay, that's fascinating. Okay, so you're one of those people, I guess, who've come from software into energy. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's been a really interesting journey of having spent 20 years from coding once upon a time. Everybody says they were a coder once upon a time, but that was really doing electronic engineering at university, to startups, to supporting governments on how do you take small pieces of tech, turn that into the multinationals of tomorrow. What policies enable those things to thrive, to do really well. Then MBA at the time when the iPhone came out in 2007, which is always fun because instead of going off to work for a bank or something like that as a traditional MBA, I decided to work for a couple of startups that were doing interesting things on the iPhone app. Now, they never really went anywhere at that particular stage, but everybody has a failed startup in them. So I joined Cisco sales and strategy roles around the world at helping to create cities of the future. It was the Internet of Things. It was the acceleration of cloud. And all of that particular movement, as well as investing in software companies at a very kind of early stage.
Okay. And that's, I guess, what you're then trying to ultimately do at Launchpad, is try and bring some of those things to reality. But you did talk about, it's your intro there around this high conviction model and how that maybe differs. Can you just maybe talk us through a little bit more around that? Why is, I don't want to call it special, but why is the BP Launchpad a bit different maybe to some of that traditional VC that we've seen?
There's a couple of areas and there's a couple of things that we think about for ourselves. One, so to be clear, it's a scale-up engine for new digital platform businesses that can help BP and the world to get to a net carbon energy position, right? Net zero carbon energy position.
Yeah.
We have looked out and we did a lot of work looking at what's interesting in venture capital, what do you get in private equity that is about speed, that is about movement, what do you get in venture capital that is around vision. And therefore, if you're doing that together with a large corporation such as BP, how do you bring that BP advantage to support the company to grow? So there's three things that we see that are very different for us. The first one is around the people. So BP Launchpad is made up of about 40 to 45 people in a number of different practices that have done this before. So they've been part of the scaling journey before. They know what it feels like to go from 50 to 400 people in 2 months, 2 years, to go from 50 to 400 people in 2 years. They know what it feels like to go through multiple changes of leadership, of instilling in mature processes. They know what it feels like and the tools and techniques to go from founder-led sales into a mature and commercial sales engine. So you're effectively taking and standing on the shoulders of giants of this team that's doing it before, that is supporting a new portfolio company for growth. So that's pretty exciting and different from what I've seen out there. For those in the VC world, they might see that as like the platform model in VC and kind of taking that and helping that to really grow connections, people that have done it before, understand the problems and the challenges in scaling. We also see the second thing is that our purpose, and our purpose is very aligned with BP, the ability to reimagine energy for people on the planet. With our focus as Launchpad about leveraging, investing in and scaling digital companies that have an ability to address this net zero, that have an ability to reimagine that and connect into it. And that relationship is so important in terms of creating that value proposition. The expertise that BP has in terms of safety, cybersecurity, in terms of operating large industrial assets, in terms of renewables and growing capability, and you then connect that and the capability with a startup and make those connections into the business. And we see this even with some of our portfolio companies where we want to test out a proof of concept. We want to see if a new approach to AI is going to work. We've got a site for you to try that. Let's work out how that does so that you've got a faster ability to be able to scale that as an organization.
And I remember when we also first met, because it was a couple of years ago now, ultimately at another conference. But I remember you talking about the idea of taking a majority stake, and so that being core to your conviction in that sense. But you also take on the higher risk. So is that correct? It is about taking a majority stake. It is about, taking, that higher risk on board and going, let's go. This is what we believe in.
Absolutely. And then there's always, like, for every founder and entrepreneur that is out there, they have a choice. And they have a choice about how they want to build their business, how big they want to build their business, who they want to do that with. And there are multiple paths that you can choose. For ours, we believe in, as I said, high conviction. We do like to take those majority stakes because we fully get backing in behind something. For the entrepreneur, what does that mean? That means that we're taking away that need for them to be going out and doing endless funding rounds out into the business. So we take that away and allow them to concentrate on running and growing the business and the capacity as they see fit, with the support from all of these scaling experts and access to BP and some of the BP advantage that may be able to bring that way.
So what's the ambition then for Launchpad? I remember reading about 5 unicorns by 2025. And maybe just if you want to explain what a unicorn is for the listener,
Yes.
that'll be helpful. But I remember that reference, quite public reference to that. So what's the ambition, and is 5 unicorns still the right thing?
For the listeners that are out there, a unicorn is obviously it's a fictional creature, but it's also a great fictional creature. It is a statement of ambition. Unicorn was actually a phrase that was coined something in 2014 by one of the VCs in Silicon Valley. Its definition is a company that has $1 billion worth of enterprise value. And so for us, the way that we translated that was, hey, if you can create 5 unicorns, if you can create $5 billion worth of enterprise value, so how are we creating massive value as a statement of ambition about how fast we want to scale these companies, how fast we want to work with the entrepreneurs to change and address this net zero. So for us, it's like we've taken that, how many unicorns, and we've translated that into the phrase of, it's about being incredibly ambitious, about finding and working with the right teams that is creating massive value, but also having an impact on the world.
Got it. Okay, look forward to seeing some mythical creatures coming out of the Launchpad. So look, I sort of alluded to it earlier, but taking a sort of a higher stake, setting yourself, also taking majority stake, and setting yourself some quite ambitious targets ultimately, does in its own way, create a potential for risk as well. And as I, know and many others who work in the energy industry, risk isn't exactly something that some of these larger companies wish to have. So what is the risk of the model as such that you do see, and maybe how you're managing some of that?
Mm-hmm. I mean, the biggest and most obvious one, David, is that they just never reach scale. They just never actually deliver on their potential that kind of comes in. It's a risk. It's obviously a risk that we're willing to take because we go after that high conviction kind of investing. But there are a couple of ways that we look at how to deal with this. First of all, there's the back to the connection of people that have done it before. So those people that are part of the Launchpad core team that actually, when they're working with the companies, know what to look out for to go, oh, we failed at this at once upon a time at this startup. Let me tell you how to get around that, or what's the approach that we take to it. So there's that level in itself. The second level is that we operate through similar to the VC model in terms of their shareholder board and management team matters. So we operate these companies with boards in that context, in order to be able to help give direction, strategic direction and oversight to the business in the way that that is growing, so that there is an independent point of view on it. And the third thing is that, like any good investor, we have regular portfolio reviews. We're looking at where is the company moving in the direction to the overall investment thesis that we had. Is that still held true? Has the market moved slower, faster, done something different in that direction? Is there more support or challenge that we should be working with this portfolio company around to unlock that in a different direction? And the other part is that we're really only 2-3 years old as Launchpad. We haven't yet had the exits. As we said up front, we have an absolute statement of ambition around this. And I think, we're going to do our best to create that, to get that success through. But there's always a risk in early stage companies, and we're willing to take on that risk because we have the conviction in some of the people and the companies that we're investing in.
Okay, so it's an interesting point you mentioned there around exit, though. So where do these companies end up?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different routes about where they could end up. As I said earlier on, our ambition is about reimagining energy for people and the planet. It is about connecting into the overall BP strategy. So one of the places about where they could end up is moving from Launchpad into BP. They could have a potential to become a business unit in BP that maybe doesn't even exist yet today. It could be that they are, that doesn't necessarily make sense in the longer term for BP strategy, but let's spin that out into a company that is supported by other investors that want to take this company to a next level. It could be that we are creating those companies where they're supportive for the entire industry. So someone else from BP decides, actually, there's a great deal of value there. We want to help that company to get to the next level and the next stage. I'm really curious to see how this evolves over the next couple of years, given that we're just announced, as you said, the 7th portfolio company today. Where this evolves and where those companies can end up. We're all here because we want to create this sustainable, growing, ever-evolving portfolio, because back to the innovation point at the beginning, innovation in these markets constantly change. So the ability to be adaptive and agile to that, Launchpad gives us in some ways that flexibility.
Very interesting. Yeah, no, so certainly, so it's kind of balancing conviction with the right people and skills with ultimately, I guess, governance is kind of what you talked about there.
Yeah.
And then optionality around whether it's exit or how you think about that business as you go forward. Okay, no, very interesting indeed. But let's maybe talk to one of the things you're actually doing right now, as you say, which is the latest acquisition number 7, or portfolio company number 7, should I say? Blueprint Power. Can you maybe just talk us through what was the commercial rationale for Blueprint? How does it fit in with what you're doing, and what can it do?
Yeah, as you said, company number 7, very excited. I'm really looking forward to the point when we get to company number 20 and we're kind of evolving that portfolio. But for now, back into Blueprint Power. Blueprint is exactly the kind of company that we want to help kind of scale this journey on it. Now, we'd met Robin actually a couple of years ago. It's been a long kind of understanding and connection with Robin and watching what they've been creating and what they've been doing. So there's a little bit of the relationship building that we've been doing with the entrepreneurial community. So in this case, what we were really tied into was this vision that Robin had in terms of buildings as the ability to be able to support energy back into the grid. Buildings as the place that we can optimize in terms of their energy flows and what is happening today. And all of that leading to, obviously, a connection about revenue and supporting kind of revenue and alternative sources of that for the building owners themselves. Robin and the team were incredible. What we got really, really excited about was their technology and their capability. We got really aligned around the vision that Robin, that Nick and the rest of the team had. And we saw this as a deep connection to be able to say, you know what, how do we support a closer connection into enabling buildings as a way to address net zero? And so that's where some of the rationale had come from. Obviously, we do all of our cases as well through full economics, full investment rationale, back to the governance point earlier. We do the checking on what assumptions do we see this build out? Where does the product roadmap go for itself? How does that team develop? And are we all aligned around those particular visions itself? So Blueprint, it really is about pursuing for us an ambitious growth plan that's going to help to grow the team. It's going to help to launch in several additional major US urban power markets beyond New York. And we want to explore how Blueprint kind of connects in with BP's region, cities, and solutions and the trading business to, overall lower the cost of renewable energy and sort of support the entire decarbonization of cities, and obviously into carbon-intensive industries at the right time.
I can see the strategic and the commercial rationale coming through very clearly there. Maybe just to take a step back, though, can you just talk through their business model, or at least what they do a little bit more, to sort of give us that sense of what is it that they do that's unique or different in that sense, and how does it align with what you're trying to create here? I'm assuming that's that kind of software energy overlap.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's the two tie-ins that we see back to the story of how do we create or how do we connect digital assets with large industrial in order to be able to address net zero. So effectively, as Blueprint Power, they have an ability to be able to pull the data from the building to understand what is happening in the building from an energy perspective over a long time frame. And so therefore give recommendations on what needs to be done to support them. The second thing that they do is that they have a piece of hardware and software that can be connected into the building to help to then control those assets in a particular way. Now, in the future that we all see, we want to start adding in, how do you add in batteries into that in order to be able to support where the building's not using that energy going back out onto the grid? How do we add in other sources, combined heat and power? Do you connect into the microgrids in a different way? So we see this as the ability to have data to understand what is happening in a building with respect to its energy, its sources, its timing, its usage, and then help to optimize that for the building owners or for the owners of the connection in.
I mean, often, and folks like the IEA maybe overplay this point, but the idea of energy efficiency and using energy efficiently does seem to be a major enabler that is very difficult to do unless you have the right kit. And this company certainly sounds like it's trying to deal with some of that. Okay, let's it's clearly an interesting opportunity. I can see how it fits very clearly with your strategy and your rationale of what you're trying to do. If we just take a step back and look at some of the other companies in your portfolio, though, and a few of them, maybe the earlier ones as you were starting to think about where you were going, etc., originally, I guess, were about optimizing hydrocarbon extraction. And I could see the overlap there with the software side of things, etc. But how are these companies helping with the energy transition?
Absolutely. And I think there's a couple of things to kind of address up front, isn't there? And in a question like that, David, which is, until we're no longer dependent on hydrocarbons, we need to make the extraction as sustainable as possible. And I know that you had Dominic Emery come on and talk a little bit about the energy outlook and kind of that rapid scenario, etc. So we can see that emissions from that energy use to reduce by 70% by 2050. But oil and gas is still going to account for a certain proportion of that energy mix, right? And there is a balance to be had between these two, as you led in with the question we're talking through. Where that translates into for us as Launchpad is that whilst our top level investment thesis is very much about how do we invest and scale digital companies that have an ability to address net zero, we break that down into first one around industrial analytics for energy system optimization. So that helps us to look at the existing energy systems and how do we optimize for those. So we've got Onyx in there and we've got Stride in there that can help on both of those two elements, plus Light and Photech. We also have a second investment thesis, which is around intelligent commodities, where a commodity could be carbon, it could be waste, it could be lithium and some of the finite resources that exist. And that is about how do we understand what is happening? How do we use technologies, data technologies, to understand what is happening in a particular space? How much is there? Can we trace that through a particular supply chain? And we firmly see finite carbon having the ability to sit within that in the verification of carbon credits associated with forestry. Our third investment thesis, which is really where Blueprint Power sits at the heart of, as well as open energy, which is around, and we interchange these terms of digital energy. But for me, it's about a vision for the electron economy and the electron economy and the entire electrification of the grid. And we've moved away from molecules to electrons. There'll be a balance, of course. But if we've moved away from that, how do we optimize for the energy systems that are there, given that everything is moving towards a data-led approach?
Okay. But I was assuming if I listen to you and you've got those different investment theses, the world's your oyster in one way, because in theory, all different parts of the energy mix and the system need to be optimized. As you say, there will be a significant shift over to electrons, but maybe not all of it. For sure, and we do need to get better at understanding how stuff works in simple terms. So yeah, I mean, does that in theory mean that you could go after anything?
You've almost like pulled on, David, like the ideal venture capital investment thesis, right? It's broad enough to be able to give us scope to work with, but specific enough, and we have some deeper levels under the investment thesis on those. I keep promising to share those in a blog at some point, but we've been keeping them a little bit close to our hearts as we go out and engage with the entrepreneurial community on those. And I think it's really interesting in an evergreen fund, if you want, in BP Launchpad, something like this, as we said, an active portfolio we will get to. Those are the first three investment theses that we're connected into and working, but that could evolve and will evolve. Does that evolve into the ability to transport goods in a different way that gets us into advanced mobility or electric vehicles in a different compassion? Do we do that in terms of a move into user interfaces and some kind of a connection that automates into the energy systems? There's so many different ways that I think we've yet to even come up with on this. And even for some of our existing investment theses, whilst we have a next level that we tend to protect for ourselves, which is, we will share one day, there's so much more that I think even we need to be doing to say, what are the next connection points in a particular value chain, in a particular component, and which ones do you need to scale more than others? And I think that's a really interesting conversation to get into. And it's one that we have a lot with our CEOs, because as we take the CEOs in, they're obviously at a very early stage still in some cases, and they will go after scaling and growth. But there's also there are many different routes to achieving that. So you could go after an inorganic acquisition trail to tap into different parts of that value chain in order to be able to create this $5 billion worth of enterprise value further down the line and the massive value connected to it.
I guess part of the reason I was asking the question is because the whole system needs to change. And the key question always is, well, which technology do you scale and why? And you basically said it there, right? There are multiple ways of doing that, whether it's at a company level or at a macro energy system level. So it does become quite complex and quite interesting. But if your thesis is broad enough to go and attack those, then that's great. And I look forward to the blog to get a bit more detail. But look, I mean, maybe it's a sort of I don't want to call it a closing question, but one of the last questions I had was around, you did talk about governance being important and how you hold your businesses accountable, but keep them on the track and help them out through their journey. With your mission being to support the net zero kind of target, I guess, that the world is aiming for, how do you think about then, having your own kind of emissions reduction targets, or certainly for your portfolio, kind of ESG KPIs? Is that something that's front and center for how they have to operate, or is that just a given and the rest is more about how we can scale this thing?
First and foremost, it's always about how do we scale this thing? And if it is linked to the investment thesis, then that should be working towards the net zero. I think you bring up a really important point, and it is something that we've been discussing back and forth internally. As we know, the ESG landscape and how do you measure these things is fraught with questions and inconsistencies and different approaches to its mix. And interestingly, we're seeing an incredible growth in what we would call carbon accounting startups in a particular space, companies that are coming in to try and use data, pull from sources, and automate that process to give a different set of verification across a number of setups. As an aside, it's a really interesting space. It is an active conversation across all of our portfolio companies at the moment about how do we instill together that reflection of that part of what we're trying to do? How do we bring that down into, it's certainly talked about at the boards, but how do we hold ourselves accountable to it?
I think it's a fair point to say that you're not the only ones, right? So
yeah.
This is something that, I wrote a blog of sorts of my own recently around the difficulties of what does the finance community really want when it's saying it's ESG aligned and what it wants from its portfolios. It is a complex picture that you have to unpick and try and understand. What are you really trying to aim for here?
But I think it's a good one to do. And I think from a very personal point of view, I do think that the UK can have a leading position in the ability to do that, in the same way that the UK's corporate governance laws are pretty spectacular. They're leading in the world, the financial systems as well. There is an ability to take a thought leadership position here within that. And we could be, if we fast forward to us having a conversation 2 or 3 years from now, we could be talking about, this is the moment we set these rules and this is what it looked like. And we pulled in this software to be able to track that, to see what that looked like. And here's the regulation that filtered in to make that happen. That would be a pretty exciting place to be.
I agree. And we'll definitely have to get you back in 2 to 3 years' time to talk about those unicorns. So
yeah.
But no, look, thanks so much. I think we have reached the end of the time available. But thank you so much for taking the time to come talk to us, especially as you've just literally closed your 7th portfolio company. So I appreciate you taking the time, Siobhan. It is a really interesting space of technology and innovation, but also software playing such an important role in the energy industry as well, and how the two overlap. So I appreciate you taking the time.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me, David.
No problems at all. And thanks everyone for listening. I hope you enjoyed it as well. Please make sure you subscribe, give us a rating, share with your friends, and speak to you next time.